Hello everyone, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is right around the corner, and today I'll be covering what I think are the top cards to watch out for in Standard and Historic play, and these will not be in any order, so with that in mind, let's jump into it. So the first card is Light-Paws Emperor's Voice. This is a 2-mana 2/2 legendary creature. When you cast an aura onto this card, you can search your library for an aura card with mana value less or equal to that aura, with a different name than each aura that you control. And you put it onto the battlefield attached to this card. So in Standard, I don't think there are enough auras to really make a splash with this card, but in Historic, aura decks already exist in forms of Azorius and Orb colors, and amongst those, this card will probably find itself in Orb colors because of cards like Kaya's Ghost Form. What makes it so scary is that if you just cast any aura onto this card, be it 1 mana aura or 2 mana aura, then you can search your library for Kaya's Ghost Form, making this card incredibly difficult to remove. And on top of that, you got enchantment auras such as All That Glitters that can also be searched within your library, making this card into a very scary threat. But of course, it's not always going to be better than cards like Horse Spirit Dancer or SRAM, just because eventually with this card, you will run out of cards because each aura that you cast won't be replaced, opposed to if you had SRAM or Horse Spirit Dancer on the board. But what this card does provide is that it can search for any aura that you want at a certain time, and you're also cheating mana at the same time, since the aura that you search becomes attached to this card immediately. Next card up on the list is March of Otherwordly Light. This is a 1 mana instant speed, X cost attached to it, and it costs 2 less to cast, which lets you exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. So you can pay the full cost by paying the X amount, but the spell's cost can be reduced. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each card that you exile white cards from your hand. So what's really nice about this card is that for a 1 mana, you can exile token or creature lands, and then you can cheat the mana cost by exiling white cards from your hand, or you can also just pay the full price if you wanted to. And the fact that it is exiling artifact, creature, or enchantment makes this card very flexible. Next card is the Wandering Emperor. It's a 4 mana planeswalker with flash, and it comes with 3 loyalty. As long as this enters the battlefield this turn, you may activate her loyalty ability anytime you could cast an instant. So which means that when you do play this card, there's an enter the battle effect trigger on the stack, and when that resolves, you can activate any of the loyalty abilities on the spot. And then you can go for +1 ability, which puts +1/+1 counter on 1 target creature, and it gains first strike, which can be used as a combat trick when your opponent attacks. You flash this card, and then you plus it on the creature, giving it first strike and a +1/+1 counter. Or you can -1 for a 2/2 creature token with vigilance, and then you can block creature that way. And to top it off, you can also -2 to exile target tapped creature, gaining you 2 life in the process. The fact that this has flash and it can utilize all 3 of its abilities when your opponent attacks makes this card a very flexible card that can be played in white aggro decks or even in control decks. The next card up on the list is Tezzeret, Betrayer of Flesh, another 4 mana planeswalker in the color blue. It starts with 4 loyalty that allows you to activate abilities of an artifact for 2 less for your first activation, and you can +1 to draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact card, or you can -2 to make an artifact into a 4/4 artifact creature, which stays permanently a 4/4 creature, by the way. And as for the ultimate, it's a -6 to get an emblem where whenever an artifact you control becomes tapped, draw a card. And I have a feeling that this card will probably see play in Historic and might see play in Standard. And I say this because there are some pretty nice artifacts out there that they've introduced in the set, such as the Virus Beetle, which is a 2 mana 1/1 artifact creature. Enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. There's also Disruption Protocol, which is essentially a counterspell if you play a lot of artifacts in your deck. And you also have Soul Transfer, which is a 3-mana sorcery, which lets you exile target creatures or planeswalker, and at the same time return target creatures or planeswalkers to your hand from the graveyard. In this case will be Tezzeret. And then you got 2-mana artifact that lets you search a basic land to your hand. The activated ability is whatever, but just the fact that this is a 2-mana artifact that lets you search a basic land, and then later on Tezzeret can turn this into a 4/4 creature, which makes this card pretty valuable. And to top it off, you got Reality Chip, which is a 2-mana 0/4 artifact creature, which lets you look at the top card of your library at any time. And then once you reconfigure, meaning you attach to a creature, it allows you to play lands and cast spells from top of your library. In which case, if you do play Tezzeret in the same deck, the reconfigure cost will only be 1 mana because of Tezzeret's passive. And with Tezzeret, you are always going to have another creature that you can reconfigure to. But worst case scenario, if you don't have a target, Tezzeret can make Reality Chip into a 4/4 creature. So definitely Tezzeret is something that should be watched out for. If the artifacts do end up being very much playable in Standard. And the next card is Dockside Chef. It's a 1-mana 1/2 enchantment creature. You can pay 2 mana cost to sacrifice an artifact or creature to draw a card. The card that you probably want to compare this to is Skullport Merchant, which is a 3-mana 1/4, which is essentially Dockside Chef, but 2 mana is more expensive. It does give you a treasure as an upside, but it's more or less the same ability, letting you sacrifice another creature or treasure to draw a card for 2 mana. So I would say that this is a pretty good replacement for that card. And another card that goes well in the black decks that play off of Merchant to sacrifice or Deadly Dispute to sacrifice. You now also have access to Junji, the Midnight Sky, which is a 5 and a 5/5 flying menace. When this card dies, you choose one. Each opponent discards 2 cards and lose 2 life, or put target non-dragon creature card from graveyard onto the battlefield. What's really nice about this card is the fact that this is a 5 and a 5/5 flying menace threat that your opponent does have to answer. But in a deck that plays things like Deadly Dispute or Dockside Chef, if your opponent tries to remove Junji, as a response, you can use a Dockside Chef or Deadly Dispute to sacrifice this card to draw a card. And if you do end up choosing each opponent discards 2 cards, not only did they use a card to try to remove this, you also drew a card and they also discarded 2 cards. So, which is just an immense swing in card advantage. And then you got Mukotai Soulripper, which is a 2-mana 4/3 artifact vehicle. When it attacks, you may sacrifice another artifact or creature. And if you do, you put +1/+1 counter on itself. It gains menace until the end of turn. Crew 2. What's really nice about this card is that in black decks at the moment in Standard, they play a lot of treasure tokens, and you play things like Eye Twitch or Shambling Ghast. So you have a lot of sacrifice targets. And at the same time, we also did get access to Junji. So amongst those, you actually have a lot of sacrifice targets, which makes this a nice early threat that you can deploy on turn 2 and pressure your opponent. And next set of cards I'm going to be taking a look at are equipments that I do think it might be playable. But the problem with equipments is the fact that if your deck is full of equipments, then you would also need creatures at the same time. But what ends up happening is when you start the game and you look at your hand only has either full of creatures or set of equipments. But the fact that these are creature and equipment at the same time makes these equipments way more playable than it used to be. Now, I would say that these equipments are nothing out of ordinary, but the fact that in Standard at the moment, you have access to Nahiri, Heir of Ancients, which is a 4-mana planeswalker with 4 loyalty. When you +1, you can create 1/1 creature token that you can attach an equipment you control to it, which makes these Kamigawa equipments infinitely better than it should be. And at the same time, the -2 abilities can search for equipments as well. And on top of that, you have the -3 ability, which deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to twice the number of equipments you control, which might push Equipment Tribal into reality in Standard. Just think about playing Blade of Oni on turn 2 or turn 3, and then you play Nahiri and you +1, equipping the Blade of Oni onto your 1/1 creature. Now your opponent has to deal with a 5/5 Menace Black Demon creature. Once they do use their removal spell on, you still have a 3/1 creature lying around to protect Nahiri from taking damage. How cool is that? Next up on the list are the Invoke cards. I think amongst the Invoke cards, the red, green, and white ones stand out from the rest. Let's look at the red one first. Invoke Calamity, it's 5 mana to cast. You may cast up to 2 instant and or sorcery spells with total mana value 6 or less from your graveyard and or hand without paying their mana cost. If those spells would be put into the graveyard, exile them instead, and then you exile the Invoke Calamity. But why I think this card is good, even though it costs 5 mana, is because it has a potential to see play in a more burn style decks, especially in Historic that plays things like Static Discharge, Wizard's Lightning, Light Up the Stage. There's a pretty good chance of seeing played in those kind of decks. And the fact that this is instant speed makes it so that at the end of their turn, cast 2 burn spells, or you can even cast things like Light Up the Stage at an instant speed, letting you untap on your turn to play whatever the cards that you've exiled with the card. Next up is Invoke the Ancients. Now, I don't believe this card will be playable in Historic, but I think in Standard, it has a shot. This is a 5 mana sorcery speed, creates 2 4/5 green spirit creature tokens, and for each of them, you put your choice of Vigilance counter, a Reach counter, or Trample counter on it. So for 5 mana, you've created 2 4/5 beat sticks, which is an incredible amount of stats for just 5 mana. And the fact that this creates 2 4/5 creatures instead of a 1 giant creature makes this card more valuable, because now if your opponent wants to remove this card, then they need to commit using 2 removal spells opposed to 1. And the next Invoke card is Invoke Justice, which is a sorcery speed that returns target permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Then distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures and or vehicles target player controls. Now, I wouldn't say that this card is particularly powerful in Standard, but the fact that this returns any target permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield makes this card more valuable than it seems. In Historic, you have things like Indomitable Creativity to put creatures onto the battlefield from your deck, or you have Mizzix's Mastery to cast high-costing sorcery spells or instant speed from your graveyard. And then you also have Refurbish to bring artifacts from your graveyard to the battlefield. I don't believe there is actually one for Enchantment. And that's why I think this card might have some uses. Let's say you return something like Omniscience from the graveyard to the battlefield, then you get to cast whatever the spells that you have in your hand. Then you could potentially storm off, casting things like Mind's Desire, letting you go through your entire deck. So although this is 5 mana, with maybe treasure ramping, I do think this card might have some potential in Historic. And next up on the list are the enchantments, and there is a good potential that enchantments might develop an archetype of their own in Standard. First up, you got Jukai Naturalist, which is 2 mana, 2/2, Selesnya color, enchantment creature, lifelink. Enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Then you got cards like Kami of Transience, which is also a 2 mana, 2/2. It is not an enchantment creature, but whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a +1/+1 counter on itself. And at the beginning of each end step, if an enchantment was put into the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, you may return Kami of Transience from your graveyard to the hand. So if you're playing this card, you probably want your deck to be enchantment focused. And the fact that this grows with each enchantment that you play, and it has a trample, makes this card a pretty big threat that your opponent does have to remove. But once they do remove this card, you can bring back to your hand when an enchantment gets put into the graveyard from the battlefield. So it's a pretty good recursive threat that your opponent has to answer. And then there's the Weaver of Harmony, which is also a 2 mana, 2/2 enchantment creature. Other enchantment creatures you control get +1/+1. So this is an enchantment card that is also an enchantment lord, which also has an activated ability that lets you copy target activated or triggered ability you control from an enchantment source. Then you also got 2 mana 1/1 enchantment creature, which lets you draw a card when it enters the battlefield. And because this is an enchantment creature, not only does it buff the Kami of Transience, but it also gets buffed from Weaver of Harmony. And not to mention, you can copy the triggered ability that put on the stack when you play Spirited Companion with Weaver of Harmony's activated ability. And let's not forget the sagas that were introduced that later becomes a creature, such as the Restoration of Eiganjo, letting you search for a basic plane, put it into your hand. Then you can also discard a card on Chapter 2, letting you return a permanent card with mana value 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This can either be a creature that you play that are also an enchantment creature, or you can also return even a land that you discarded from in Chapter 2, ramping you for that turn. And then on Chapter 3, it becomes a 3/4 enchantment creature with Vigilance, which lets you create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token when attacks or blocks. Another saga that actually has been on my mind is Michiko's Reign of Truth. This is a 2-mana saga that I thought this card was bad at first, but now that the enchantment tribal deck is more creature focused, since all the enchantment cards are in fact a creature, this card becomes significantly better than I thought it was. The first and second saga will give you a significant buff to a target creature, allowing you to attack for large amount of damage. And in the third chapter, it transforms into a creature that gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control, potentially making this into a very large creature. And to top it off, we have Satsuki the Living Lore, which is a 2-mana 1/3 legendary creature that lets you put a lore counter on each saga you control, allowing you to accelerate the sagas that you control, letting them transform into a creature at a faster cycle. And once it dies, you get to either return target saga or enchantment creature you control to its owner's hand, such as the Spirited Companion. You can flicker it back into your hand, letting you draw again, or you can turn target saga card from your graveyard to your hand. And to close things off, you have the legendary lands that are, I would think, one of the best lands that I've seen recently. This has channel ability, which is essentially you pay the cost and you discard this land, letting you play the effects that you see on the card. This is not counterable by any means, which makes this incredibly powerful. The fact that this comes untapped makes this card a must include in every deck. You might say that the cost for effect might be too expensive for what it does, but just think about the opportunity cost. The cost for playing this card, to having this card in your deck, is so low because this is a land. You just play it out if you don't have lands. And if you have enough lands, you can just keep it in your hand until you can finally get to use it. I think I've covered everything that I think will have an impact in Standard and Historic. And I hope you enjoyed the video so far. If you liked the video, leave a thumbs up. If you disagree with any of the things that I've said or have any questions in general, leave a comment down below as well. Once a new set drops, I think I'll actually be checking out Standard first before I jump into Historic. But don't worry, I'll definitely be returning to Historic as soon as possible. But yeah, I'll be signing off and I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.